welcome back. I know I'm back. I said I was going to go ahead and try to do this daily, but I'm in the middle of a move. I am moving across the country permanently, so it's been a little hectic, and I wanted to get back to it. So this is chapter 2 of The War Before the War. Fugitive slaves in the struggle for America's soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. When delegates from the former colonies of Great Britain convened at Philadelphia in May 1787, with the aim of forming a common government, slavery had been an essential part of colonial life for nearly 300 years. Between the first European settlements and the early 19th century, more than 12 million human beings were seized in Africa and shipped to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies of South and Central America, to the Dutch, British, and Danish colonies in the West Indies, and to French, Spanish, and British North America, under conditions that, despite the millions of words expended in trying to describe them, still defy comprehension. In order to achieve maximum capacity for carrying per vessel during the Middle Passage between capture in Africa and distribution in America, slave traders packed their human cargo onto racks with just enough space between them to accommodate a human body. Each man, woman, or child was confined by the press of bodies to less than a square yard, barely able to move during the inevitable bouts of vomiting and diarrhea. Beneath the racks, or platforms, the floor of the hold became so slippery with fluid and feces, according to one 18th century observer, the scene resembled a slaughterhouse. Slave ships could be smelled from miles away. Of course, over the course of the 1790s, one ship sailed every other day on average from Britain to Africa in order to pick up slaves and take them to the New World. State-of-the-art vessels were equipped with raised afterdecks to facilitate surveillance during periods when slaves were permitted in the open air, and with swivel guns in case they became unruly. Uprisings occurred on roughly 10% of the voyages. Almost all failed. On at least one French ship, more than 90% of the passengers were children. In 1790, an English physician who had witnessed conditions at sea testified to the House of Commons about a slave woman who, having been flogged for some infraction, was flogged again for resisting the first flogging. After she died from her wounds, her flayed body was fed to the sharks. The same witness spoke of a young African man who tore at his own throat with his fingernails and bled to death. Despite incentives to deliver slaves in saleable condition to auctioneers in the New World awaiting fresh shipments, at least 1 million human beings died en route from disease, suicide, beatings, and failed revolts, whereupon their corpses were tossed into the sea. Over the centuries, most of the survivors were unloaded in South or Central America, but roughly 500,000 were delivered to British North America. They came through such ports as Newport, New York, and Baltimore, as well as Charleston and Savannah, from which the great majority were sent inland to work at planting, harvesting, and processing tobacco, cotton, sugar, rice, indigo, and other crops for the European and later the American markets. One reason that importing slaves remained profitable for so long was the calculation by slave owners that replacement was cheaper than maintenance. More than 150 years after the first death, ships arrived in Virginia. More than 150 years after the first death ships arrived in Virginia, the eminent Virginian Thomas Jefferson sat in his rooms at Philadelphia, drafting the document that has come to be known as the Declaration of Independence. He began with the stirring claim that all men are born equal, with an inalienable right to pursue happiness. But even as he announced the creation of a new nation devoted to these fine principles, more than 500,000 of its 3 million people or enslaved. In the 5 southern colonies, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, slaves accounted for 2 in every 5 persons. The slave population of the northern colonies was much smaller, ranging from 20,000 in New York to barely 200 in New Hampshire. But northern investors held large stakes in slave-produced commodities, and most slaves transported for sale along the southern coast were carried by northern ships. Slavery was a national institution before the creation of the nation. It had not always been reserved for blacks. Half a century before the Revolution, native tribal leaders sold so many captives from rival tribes to white settlers that Indians accounted for nearly a third of the slaves in South Carolina. But unlike an imported slave or servant, as one historian points out, the Indian was at home in the American forest and could survive in it. Consequently, he was more likely to escape and had a better chance of succeeding. By comparison, Africans and their descendants proved to be more plentiful, easier to obtain, and once they were distributed to buyers, a more secure form of human property. Still, a slave of any origin presented in what a bail hearing is called a flight risk. At the height of the African slave trade, captives awaiting transport were fitted with spiked collars designed to snag in the underbrush if they tried to escape inland from the coast. Such contrivances never fully solved the problem. As much as in Africa, slaves unwilling to remain enslaved were a persistent annoyance in America. South Carolina adopted its first, quote, act to prevent runaways in 1683, limiting the mobility of servants as well as of slaves. That law was soon updated to authorize any sheriff to, quote, raise a convenient party of men to pursue, apprehend, and take runaways either alive or dead, at public expense. 60 years later, the legislature was still working on the problem. A new law, adopted in 1751, prescribed a reward for the capture of an armed runaway who had been at large for more than 6 months. Even if the captor was himself a slave, he was eligible for compensation, though at half the amount paid to slave catchers who were free. In 1770, Georgia established a nightly slave patrol in its main port city that came to be known as the Savannah Watch. In the waning years of British rule, colonial officials favored draining wetlands for the purpose of not only of planting, but of preventing deserting slaves and wild beasts from finding shelter in the swamps. The end of imperial government did nothing to mitigate the problem. Shortly before drafting the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson offered a reward between 40 shillings and 10 pounds, depending on how far away the quarry was caught, for an artful and knavish runaway who had served him as a carpenter and shoemaker before making off with one of his horses along with shoemaking tools. To read the irritable prose in Jefferson's advertisement, along the same writer's soaring calls for liberty in the Declaration, is, to put it mildly, a startling experience. The gift for casuistry, or as some called it more bluntly, hypocrisy, evinced by Jefferson and his fellow revolutionaries, did not go unnoticed at the time. How is it, asked the English moralist Samuel Johnson in 1775, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? On the eve of the American Revolution, the French-born Quaker Anthony Benezet, who had immigrated to America as a young man, declared with fearless lucidity that, quote, no Christian can keep a slave, unless he is willing himself and posterity should be slaves. After war broke out with Britain, Abigail Adams, wife of Jefferson's rival from Massachusetts, John Adams, wrote to her husband that it is iniquitous to fight for ourselves for what we are robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. This is the Virginia Gazette ad that Thomas Jefferson ran. Years later, Jefferson privately condemned his fellow Southerners, somehow exempting himself for being zealous with their own liberties while trampling on those of others. To make matters still more confounding, revolutionary leaders issued regular condemnations of slavery in the many broadsides and pamphlets through which they proclaimed their ideals to the world. Prominent among these was the original text of the Declaration. At the request of a 5-man committee charged by the Continental Congress with producing a public statement justifying the rebellion, the other members were Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, Jefferson composed the first draft. With an ear for phrasing worthy of the musician he was, he opened with an arresting chord, the theme of equality, and then played variations on the theme of oppression. In the course of his composition, he accused the king, among other things, of maintaining an occupying army at the expense of his colonial subjects, appointing magistrates without popular consent, and imposing taxation without representation. To cap off the catalogue of grievances, he charged the king with waging cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the pursuits of a distant people. Jefferson would have liked to blame king and parliament for the piratical warfare by which Africans were stolen from their homes and to exonerate the colonists who received them. In this respect, he was more self-forgiving and less candid than his elder colleague Benjamin Franklin, who had levied the same charge against Britain 6 years earlier. You bring the slaves to us and tempt us to purchase them, but concluded that the receiver is as bad as the thief. Jefferson's proposed attack on the slave trade never made it into the final draft of the Declaration. By 1776, demands for slave labor were declining in Virginia, but growing in Georgia and South Carolina. Like opponents of gun control laws today, slave owners in the Deep South, whether or not they needed fresh supplies at the moment, were inclined to oppose any constraint of the trade, lest it lead down a slippery slope towards curtailing their right to own slaves at all. Jefferson's colleagues on the drafting committee were aware of these objections, and they also recognized the rhetorical weakness of condemning the slave trade while failing to condemn slavery itself. Another reason for excising the passage might have been to avoid antagonizing friends of the revolutionary cause in Britain, where Parliament did not get around to outlawing the slave trade until 1807. In the end, with a mixture of motives, the committee struck out the entire passage in an act of what the author called mutilation. Jefferson later claimed it was done, quote, in complaisance to Georgia and South Carolina, as if the crescendo of his piece had been ripped out of the score. A dozen years later, looking back at the debate as well as the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when the issue of the slave trade came up again, Jefferson's Virginia neighbor James Madison asserted that, quote, the Southern states would not have entered into the Union of America without at least the temporary permission of that trade. Yet Northerners and Southerners alike continued to invoke slavery as a synonym for evil itself. Frequently and fervently, they described the punitive policies imposed on them by Britain as tantamount to slavery. Those who are taxed without their own consent, wrote John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, are slaves. According to Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, they who have no property are reduced to the most abject slavery. John Witherspoon, the slave-owning president of Princeton, a favorite college for sons of the Southern gentry, warned his students, including Madison, class of 1771, who was accompanied to college by his personal slave Sawney, that to hesitate in the struggle against Britain is to consent to our own slavery. In these and many other cases, The word slavery became shorthand for the colonists' sense of being demeaned and despised by their British masters. For anyone having trouble distinguishing between the metaphor and the real thing, Franklin was ready to help. A slave, he explained in 1770, quote, is a human creature stolen, taken by force, or bought of another or of himself with money, and who being so taken or bought is compelled to serve the taker or purchaser during pleasure or during life. He may be sold again or let for hire by his master to another, and is then obliged to serve that other. He is one who is bound to obey not only the commands of his master, but also the commands of the lowliest servant of that master, when set over him, who must come when he is called, go when he is bid, and stay when he is ordered. Though to the farthest part of the world, and in the most unwholesome clime, who must wear such clothes as his master thinks fit to give him, and no other, must be content with such food and subsistence as his master thinks fit to order for him, or with such small allowance in money as shall be given him in lieu of victuals or clothing, who must never absent himself during his master's service without leave, who is subject to severe punishments for small offenses, to enormous whippings, and even death for absconding from his service or for disobedience to orders. But even as he offered this unsparing view of the matter, Franklin himself still owned at least 2 slaves. While living in London in the early 1760s, he had shared rooms with his son William, William's slave King, who ran away in 1760, and his own slave Peter, who was scheduled in Franklin's will to be emancipated upon his owner's death, and who conducted himself as well as I can expect, so we rub on pretty comfortably. As a young newspaper editor, Franklin had accepted advertisements for human merchandise, one of which featured a breeding Negro woman about 20 years of age. Another offered a likely Negro wench about 15 years of age. Likely referred to her prospects for bearing children. An additional selling point in her case was that, having had the smallpox, she was unlikely to suffer a recurrence. Admirers of that great philosopher, Dr. Franklin, included George Washington, who, as a child of 11, had inherited 10 slaves from his father. By the 1770s, he owned over 100. From time to time, he added to the number by buying directly off slave ships in order to save the trouble and the auctioneer's commission of competing for them in public sales. In short, regardless of what they said or wrote, America's founders were thoroughly implicated in the bloody business they decried. The schools and colleges they attended, from William and Mary in the South to Harvard in the North, were endowed with funds earned on the backs of slaves. Many of them, including some who denounced slavery, like George Mason of Virginia and James Wilson of Pennsylvania, were slave owners for much or all of their lives. Jefferson, we now know, fathered children by his enslaved mistress, Sally Hemings. Washington, who claimed to possess slaves very repugnantly to my own feelings, and only because imperious necessity compels, used them not only to manage Mount Vernon, but as laborers in a commercial distillery he acquired shortly before he died. Even in the case of those amongst the founders who disliked and condemned slavery, the banks and businesses to which they entrusted their personal assets were engaged directly or indirectly in slave-based commerce. From the first days of the Republic, no one who personally owned slaves could be quite sure of that transporting them from one state to another would not put his right of ownership at risk. Upon assuming the presidency in 1789, when the federal government was still located at Philadelphia, Washington sought confidential legal advice from Attorney General Edmund Randolph, who had lost some of his own slaves by failing to heed a 1780 Pennsylvania law granting freedoms to slaves brought into Pennsylvania and residing there more than 6 months. Although the word consecutive or continuous did not appear in the statute, the exact meaning of the 6-month provision was a matter of dispute, and so it remained for 40 years. In one case, Commonwealth versus Chambre, 1794, the lawyer representing a group of slaves taken out of state by their owner after 5 months and 3 weeks made the inventive argument that they were legally free because their captivity spanned more than 6 lunar months. Not until 1821, with the case of Butler v. Delaplane, in which counsel for the slave-owning plaintiff was Thaddeus Stevens, future leader of the radical anti-slavery faction of the Republican Party, was the law finally clarified to mean continuous day-to-day resistance for 6 calendar months. And slave owners were warned against fraudulent shuffling backwards and forwards into and out of the state in order to restart the clock. Alert to these ambiguities, Washington had asked his personal secretary, Tobias Lear, to consult Attorney General Randolph for guidance. The advice he got back was that if before the expiration of 6 months your slaves could, upon any pretense whatsoever, be carried or sent out of state, but for a single day, a new era would commence on their return, from whence the 6 months must be dated. Washington gratefully adapted this stratagem and asked Lear to please keep it private, except for yourself and Mrs. Washington, in whose company he sometimes dispatched his slaves out of state for short periods of time. Among female slaves, Washington had a taste for the fat and lusty. Among males, he looked for straight-limbed specimens with good teeth and good countenances. While president, he placed a newspaper advertisement seeking the return of a runaway mulatto girl, much freckled, whose flight caught him so much by surprise that although he knew she had taken off with several changes of clothes, he could not recall exactly which ones. Convinced that she had been lured away by an unscrupulous Frenchman, he was still trying to get her back until almost the end of his life in 1799, by which time she was living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire as a free woman, married with children. For these and many other reasons, it remains no easy matter to come to terms with Samuel Johnson's question. How, indeed, did the Founding Fathers reconcile their complicity with slavery with their commitment to liberty? It is a compulsory question with no satisfactory answer. But there are partial answers. To begin with, the founders were born into a world in which slavery was widely regarded as a universal feature of human society. The more learned among them, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, John Jay, knew that Aristotle, king of philosophers, had declared it to be part of the natural order of things. Quote, "The lower sort are by nature slaves," Aristotle wrote in the Politics, and it is, quote, "better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master." When they turned from classical to what would now be Judeo-Christian authorities, the founders discovered warrant for slavery there too. The Hebrew Bible, Exodus 21:7, Leviticus 25:44 through 46, describes buying, selling, inheriting, and punishing slaves. It prescribes rules governing sexual relations between masters and slaves. Quote, "When a master sells his daughter as a slave and she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter." And in cases where a master has injured his slave, it stipulates when punishment or pardon is called for. Exodus 21, passages 20 through 21. "If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. Exodus 21, passages 26 through 27. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Nor did the coming of the Christian gospel banish slavery to the heathen darkness. St. Paul, 6 Ephesians, 1 Timothy, exhorts slaves to obey their masters, and in the letter to Philemon, he says explicitly that fugitive slaves must be returned, a requirement sometimes known as the Pauline mandate. Nor was the fact that Christ himself never spoke against slavery lost on Southern slaveholders, who construed his silence on the subject as implicit affirmation. In 1989, for instance, the National Intelligencer, which was published in Washington, ran an article asking, quote, if domestic slavery had been deemed by Jesus Christ the atrocious crime which it is now represented to be, could it have been passed over without censure? Nevertheless, growing numbers of Christian clergy spoke out against slavery over the course of the 18th century. Some regarded it as incompatible with the general spirit of Christ's teachings, as when the Calvinist minister Samuel Hopkins declared that the whole divine revelation condemns slavery. Others cited specific scriptural passages that seemed to disapprove it, such as Matthew 18:25 through 27, which recounts an incident in which a man is about to be sold along with his wife and children as satisfaction for unpaid debts, until, quote, the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave the debt. Until the mid-19th century, Christianity in the new nation was more or less synonymous with Protestantism. Along the relatively small number of Roman Catholics, few spoke or wrote on the subject of slavery. John Carroll, 1735 to 1815, first American bishop and founder of Georgetown University, which was saved from financial ruin in 1838, when a group of Jesuit priests sold their slaves and directed the proceeds into the college treasury, encouraged manumission, but never advocated a policy of general emancipation. Among early American Protestants, notable anti-slavery clergy included the Baptist John Leland, the Methodist Francis Asbury, and the Quakers John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, who regarded the French and Indian War as a divine judgment on the slave-trading people. Samuel Hopkins, once a slaveholder himself, preached against the institution in slave-trading Newport, while leading merchants sat sullen in the pews. In the auspicious year 1776, Hopkins, who long after his death became the subject of a laudatory novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, published a dialogue concerning the slavery of the Africans, showing it to be the duty and the interest of American states to emancipate all their African slaves, a duty he regarded as consonant with, indeed required by, a revolution waged on behalf of the rights of men. Especially in New England, and to a lesser degree in the Upper South, a significant minority of clergy across denominations denounced slavery as one of the crying sins of the land. But it would be a flattering exaggeration to say that in the years leading to the Revolution, American Christianity became broadly inimical to slavery. George Whitefield, the English itinerant preacher whose tour of the colonies in the 1740s helped spark the evangelical revival that became known as the Great Awakening, spoke forcefully against slavery, so much that Phyllis Wheatley, the celebrated black poet who had been sold out of Africa as a child and purchased by a Boston family, lamented upon Whitfield's death in 1770 that "we hear no more the music of thy tongue." Hi, Umbra Wolf! But by the 1750s, Whitfield had decided that slavery was essential for the prosperity of Georgia, where he supported a school for white orphans financed in part by profits from a plantation he owned in South Carolina, worked by black slaves. Of Whitfield's famous contemporary and Hopkins' mentor, Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758, who owned 2 slaves, it has been said that he cared less about slaves than bad books, a reference to a scandal that broke out in Edwards' church in Northampton, Massachusetts, when adolescent boys passed around illustrated anatomical textbooks as aids to sexual arousal. For most people in the 18th century, North and South, whether they were classicists, theologians, or laymen with only a smattering of formal learning, the question was not whether there should be masters and slaves in the world, but how masters and slaves should behave towards each other in a world where there had always been both. To face this fact is to encounter one of the most demanding challenges in thinking about history, explaining how people in the past could have failed to see what seems so clear to us in retrospect. This is an imperative task, but also a delicate and exacting one. On the one hand, explanation can shade into excuse. On the other hand, passing judgment on the past can be a form of self-congratulation in the present. The hard fact is that in a world where most men and nearly all women lived in some form of unfreedom, tied to one thing or another, to an indenture, an apprentice contract, land rent, a mill, workhouse, or prison, a husband or father, slavery was an unremarkable form of human relations. Just how unremarkable may be gleaned from a diary entry of May 22nd, 1712, recorded by a member of the nascent Virginia gentry, William Byrd. Along with what he ate and drank, hot chocolate was a favorite, and how his bowels were working, Byrd noted some of the uses to which he and his wife liked to put their slaves. Quote, "My wife caused Prue to be whipped violently, notwithstanding I desired not, which provoked me to have Annika whipped likewise, who had deserved it much more, on which my wife flew into such a passion that she hoped she would be revenged upon me." "Take that," or something to that effect, says wife to husband, ordering the whipping of his pet slave Prue. "Take that," says husband to wife, ordering her favorite, Annika, to be whipped in recompense. This was a human economy that fit perfectly with Aristotle's view that the slave is a living tool and the tool a lifeless slave. It was an early instance of the long unfinished history through which white people, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s appallingly accurate phrase, have found so many ways to inflict on black people a, quote, degenerating sense of nobodiness. In the case of the Byrds, and one suspect in many cases before and since, beating blacks seems to have had an aphrodisiac effect. Even if master and mistress did not stay close enough to watch the lashings, they likely heard Prue and Annika's cries before or while settling their marital quarrel with a bout of sex, which the husband construed as a gift to his repentant spouse. Quote, "I was reconciled to my wife and gave her a flourish in token of it." Whether she consented or resisted is not recorded. Some 70 years later, Jefferson, arguably the most sophisticated thinker in the revolutionary America, declared that, quote, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if he ever had a chosen people." The people he had in mind were white farmers, who, by working the land with their hard and honest labor, would be repositories of virtue in the new nation, a counterweight to the wheeling, dealing life of cities, where, Jefferson thought, people were liable to be drawn through the life of commerce into duplicity and greed. How could a man of such formidable intellect write such a sentence without apparently looking up through his study window at the laboring in the earth on his behalf? Chosen people indeed. At his beck and call, subject to his wish and whim, they were chosen, like the Israelites of old, to bear the bitter burden of knowing that they were owned. By the time Jefferson performed the dark magic of rendering slaves invisible, the disappearing trick had a long history, and it was long from over. Another reason that slavery failed to provoke focused outrage in early America was that the distinction between servitude for life and labor, contracted for a term of years, could be a formal distinction without much substantive difference. Beginning in the 17th century, thousands of indentured servants, men, women, and children, whose transportation and upkeep were paid in exchange for a term of service, came to the New World from Northern Europe, especially the British Isles. Their voyage was nothing like the Middle Passage endured by African slaves, but it was no pleasure cruise either. According to one 18th century witness, it was an ordeal of, quote, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, attended by so many lice, especially on the sick people, that they have to be scraped off their bodies so they might appear minimally presentable to buyers evaluating them as prospective workers once they arrived. As for their pre-voyage experience, labor merchants in British or continental port towns were able, in the words of the historian Richard Hofstadter, to, quote, lure children with sweets, to seize upon the weak or the gin-sodden and take them aboard ship, and to bedazzle the credulous or weak-minded by fabulous promises of an easy life in the New World. Often their victims were taken roughly in hand, and, pending departure, held in imprisonment either on shipboard or in low-grade hostels or brothels. In 1770, the surveyor of customs at Annapolis, having watched buyers at the pier inspecting shipments of immigrants with particular attention to their muscles and teeth, believed they were destined to groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage. Worse, in other words, than what African-born slaves faced. He expected masters of bonded servants to extract every ounce of labor during their years of indenture with no regard to effects on their health, while slaves, being lifelong property, had the advantage, he thought, that it was in the master's interest to extend the span of their working lives. This hypothesis overestimated the rationality of the slave system and underestimated the irrationality of racial contempt, but it was not always groundless. Because some servants renewed their terms of compulsory service repeatedly until they stretched out over a lifetime, average life expectancy in the late 18th century was around 40, indentured servitude was not inevitably a temporary condition. And because masters sometimes emancipated their slaves for reasons ranging from compassion to aggravation at having to maintain them past their useful years, slavery was not always a permanent condition. And so servants and slaves, to whom William Byrd referred indistinguishably as bondsmen, were often conflated, as they would be in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, known too narrowly as the Fugitive Slave Clause, which applied to both. The day-to-day experience of a servant was not always markedly better than that of a slave. One Pennsylvania clergyman, writing in 1765, lamented the fate of a German immigrant girl whose contract binding her to a local family for 6.5 years required that she be taught to read and write, but who, upon completing her term, could neither read a letter nor pray a single word, and had been so completely debauched that she prefers to remain with her mistress because she is satisfied with her brutish life. By the time of the Revolution, the number of apprentices, servants, and slaves in Philadelphia was about the same as free-wage laborers, and there's no telling the scale of exploitation, sexual and otherwise, for which they were subjected, regardless of the distinction between servitude for a term and servitude for life. As late as 1835, former slaves freed by emancipation laws throughout the North feared, often with good reason, that if their children were to become indentured servants, they would be treated as they themselves have been while slaves. Absconding was no less rampant among servants than slaves. The problem of pirating, enticing a bound servant away from his master with promise of pay or better working conditions or early release, became so widespread that criminal and civil penalties, whipping, consignment to the stocks, were often severe, especially in the tobacco colonies. To provide food or shelter to a servant other than one's own was to risk punishment even if he had been abandoned by his master. A short story, written in 1831, set in the Revolutionary period, Nathaniel Hawthorne gives a glimpse of this penal world, in which wanted posters for runaway servants, as commonplace as "Don't text and drive" billboards today, were all but indistinguishable from those for runaway slaves. Hawthorne describes a flyer posted on a tavern wall that offers a reward for the capture of a bonded servant who had been wearing, when he went away, gray coat, leather breeches, and who, in an act of impudent thievery, absconded not only with himself, but with his master's third best hat. Here's a typical newspaper notice from the third decade of the 19th century. $10 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the night of 15th instant, 2 apprentice boys legally bound, named William and Andrew Johnson. The former is of a dark complexion, black hair, eyes, and habits. The latter is very fleshy, freckled face, light hair, and fair complexion. I will pay the above word to any person who will deliver said apprentices to me in Raleigh, or I will give the above reward for Andrew Johnson alone. Because some jurisdictions added additional time and service for periods of unexcused absence, fugitive servants risked longer in terms of servitude if apprehended, with habitual runaways facing extensions of as much as 5 years. Early America was a nation teeming with pursuers and pursued, and they were by no means only masters and slaves. For free people as well as those enslaved, violence was routine. Corporal punishment was standard practice in families and schools. Public cages, stocks, and whipping posts were familiar sights in the squares and commons of villages and towns. Although by the late 18th century flogging came under attack as a barbarous practice, and new penal institutions called penitentiaries arose with the stated purpose of rehabilitation rather than retribution, beatings continued out of sight behind the walls. The shower bath, an early version of waterboarding, was a favored means for disciplining unruly prisoners or those who, for one reason or another, displeased their jailers. The pervasiveness of such practices of unfreedom leads one historian to conclude that slavery and other forms of enforced labor did not seem all that different from free labor. A majority of early Americans, not only slaves and servants, but convicts, beggars, children, vagabonds, and virtually all women lived at the mercy of those wielding power over them. Slavery thus enjoyed a kind of camouflage. Today, no reasonable person disputes that in the hierarchy of dependencies, it was the most base and dependent. But that conclusion was a long time coming. As late as 1850, Herman Melville, who detested slavery but knew other forms of subjection, asked, "Who ain't a slave? Tell me that." It was a question to which Frederick Douglass reacted with earned exasperation. Quote, "It is common in this country to distinguish every bad thing by the name of slavery. Intemperance is slavery. To be deprived of the right to vote is slavery, says one. To have to work hard is slavery, says another. And I do not know but that if we should let them go, they would say that to eat when we are hungry, to walk when we desire to have exercise, or to minister to our necessities, or have necessities at all, is slavery. Having fled from and fought against the real thing, Douglas had good reason for his scorn. As for our scorn towards those who owned or tolerated the owning of slaves, one might want to balance it with some self-interrogation. Calling out the moral failures of the past surely brings with it an obligation to confront one's own complicity with forms of unfreedom in the present. For many, if not Americans, in the first decades of the Republic, slaves were out of sight or out of mind, inasmuch of the same way that millions of incarcerated or impoverished people are today, until some shocking incident or anguished plea gives them a moment's visibility before they vanish again. That slavery seemed so ordinary for so many for so long is all the more striking because it had two features that would seem to have made it conspicuous. The first was that except in cases of manumission or of slaves who managed to buy their freedom, or in the relatively rare instances of successful escape, it was a life sentence. It was a closed system in which girls were circulated as breeders and boys as human machines for producing saleable goods, including their own children, all of whom were doomed to repeat the cycle of coercion from which the only deliverance was death. The second distinctive feature was that slavery selected its victims by color or blood. Historians still debate whether the idea that black people were suited by nature to be slaves preceded or followed their enslavement, a debate that seems fair to call, in the pejorative sense of the word, academic. Whether racist ideas created the conditions for slavery, or slavery was justified ex post facto by racist ideas, made precious little difference to the enslaved. Either way, many if not most colonial Americans thought it as reasonable to enslave a black person as to train a dog or saddle a horse. A favorite source for making the case was Genesis 9:18-25, in which Noah's son, Ham, future patriarch of the Canaanites, comes upon his father drunken and uncovered within his tent, a sight he reports with salacious delight to his brothers, Shem and Japhet, who, in order to rescue the dignity that their brother had defiled, took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. With eyes averted, Shem and Japhet withdrew from his presence and saw not their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his younger son had done to him, and he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Sorry for the light. It may seem incredible that a foundation as flimsy as this story could support the enormous edifice of slavery for millennia to come. But through the work of medieval and early modern exegetes, a pernicious tradition developed that Ham's curse not only entailed exile and disgrace, but also left him stigmatized by a darkened skin, a mark of shame to be passed on to his descendants. Thus, Ham came to be identified as the founding father of black Africans. In fact, skin color was no criterion for categorizing humanity in the ancient world, and slavery in classical times had no particular association with race. It was the price one paid for ending up on the losing side of a war, as it continues to be in some parts of the world today, especially for women and girls. Race-based slavery, by contrast, was a medieval invention that became a modern convention. With the forced influx of millions of African laborers into North America, it turned out to be a convenient convention indeed. If religion furnished one pillar for the rationalization of New World slavery, science seemingly provided the other. Learned naturalists claimed that surface distinctions in pigment and physiognomy dignified deeper distinctions in mental capacity and character. In this respect, America's founding fathers were, to one extent or another, racists. not in the loose sense of the word as we use it today to signify bias, fear, contempt, or patronizing pity, but in a more technical sense. They were impressed by so-called evidence, preserved in most anatomical museums, that feet, fingers, craniums, and genitals of black people proved that blacks were not fully human, but a, quote, intermediate species between the white man and the ape. Blacks were supposedly less reflective and less courageous than whites, and because of their relatively undeveloped nervous systems, had a higher threshold for pain and a less delicate sense of touch. And so it went on and on. Long after the Civil War, in the Anthropological Museum of Harvard University, America's leading black intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois, found himself confronted by an exhibit of skeletons arranged from a little monkey to a tall, well-developed white man, with a Negro barely outranking a chimpanzee. There was no great distance to travel between such ideas and what would later become the ideology of Nazism, according to which intermarriage between Aryans and the lower races could only result, as Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, in monstrosities between man and ape. Such notions infected Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, a treatise on New World nature and culture written in response to queries put to him in 1780 by the secretary of the French delegation in Philadelphia. Much of that book is excruciating to read today, as when Jefferson asserts that the orangutan prefers black women over those of his own species. At stake in Jefferson's mind was an emerging theory known as polygenesis, which posited that blacks and whites, having evolved through two distinct lines of descent rather than from common ancestors, were unsuited for interbreeding. According to this hypothesis, by which Jefferson was attracted but not entirely convinced, blacks were more naturally situated to mate with apes than with human males or females. It was a theory difficult to square with his own sexual practice, one reason perhaps that he remained wary of it. It is always hard to know to what degree advanced thought converges with or diverges from popular opinion. With respect to racial attitudes in early America, we get a hint from James Mars, who was born a slave in New York in 1790 and remained enslaved in Connecticut until age 25. In a memoir published in multiple editions between 1864 and 1876, Mars recalled from his childhood that slaves at the North were admitted to be a species of the human family. And yet he also remembers being told as a boy that slaves had no souls and that they would never go to heaven, let them do ever so well. Racial contempt was not a regional phenomenon. It was nationwide. Yet despite all such encouragements to believe that blacks were naturally inferior to whites, the founders hedged their bets. They proceeded with a certain nervous tentativeness, as when Jefferson described the final supposition as a conjecture pending further observation. One finds the same rhythm of proposition and retraction in a letter from Alexander Hamilton to John Jay, in which it is possible to watch rationality mitigate prejudice as Hamilton deletes the word perhaps and substitutes probably. Their natural faculties, he writes of blacks, are, perhaps is scratched out and probably is added, as good as ours. In another instance of self-correction, Franklin, who had written in 1751 that slaves are thieves by nature, converted that claim 18 years later into the quite different point that slaves may be compelled by the nature of slavery to become thieves. Perhaps the stories of the founders on race is best summed up in a remark by Franklin, made in another context at his own expense. Quote, "So convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." On that view, all the high-flown theories that blacks are designated for slavery by nature, God, history, fate, or whatever force one prefers to credit or blame suddenly and utterly collapse. All the weighty reasons for tolerating slavery were actually nothing but rationalizations. Patrick Henry, whose famous oath, "Give me liberty or give me death," became the rallying cry, became the battle cry of the Revolution, admitted as much. Writing in 1773 with a certain disarming candor to an anti-slavery activist, he confessed that while he shared his correspondent's antipathy to the institution, he found himself drawn along to keep his own slaves simply because he could not deny the general inconveniency of living here without them. Here was the long and short of it. Slavery served his interest. All other arguments on its behalf are bogus, a word the founders would not have recognized, but whose meaning they well understood. And somewhere, in heart, if not in head, they knew it. It's the end of chapter 2. I will try to do another chapter before I leave the area, but I intend to be reading a chapter as often as I can to get through the book, and I'll be streaming that. Thank you for joining me, and take care. It's getting crazy out there.